Have you ever been in a situation where all of your plans just fell apart? If you're like me, then you often try to be organized and plan everything out ahead of time. You want to make sure that every detail is thought of because you don't want to leave anything to chance. Yet, despite that, there still seems to be times where everything falls apart and just nothing goes according to plan. Well, today, as we continue through our series in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to be looking at the lives of three men whose lives do not go according to plan, but who are used by God in miraculous ways to advance His plan and purposes. And by taking a look at the lives of these guys, we're going to see that God's plan is bigger and better than anything we could manufacture for ourselves. We're going to see that at the end of the day, God's plan stands. And what we need to do as people who live by faith with complete trust and confidence in God is we need to trust in God's plans for our lives. In Hebrews 11, verses 20 to 22, we read this. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. In these three verses, Hebrews introduces us to three different people from the book of Genesis: Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And Isaac is someone that we've already been introduced to. Last week, we talked about how Isaac is the son of Abraham, the man that God had made a covenant or a promise with, in where God had promised Abraham three things: land, nation, and blessing. God had promised Abraham to give him and his descendants a land to call their own. And then he sent Abraham off in search of that land without even knowing where he was going. Then he promised to give him descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, which he did through the descendants of Abraham's son Isaac. And then the third part of God's promise to Abraham, that he would make him into a blessing to the entire world, is ultimately fulfilled in the person of Jesus, who comes as a descendant of Abraham and who saves the world from its sins through his death on the cross. Last week we looked at a time in Abraham's life where God had tested him by calling him to sacrifice his son Isaac, but then spared Isaac's life by providing a ram for Abraham to use instead. And today we're looking at a time when Isaac had grown up and has two twin sons named Jacob and Esau. And right at the beginning of their lives, in Genesis 25, we see a conflict that's formed between Jacob and Esau right from the womb. In Genesis 25, verse 23, God says this to Rebekah, that's Jacob and Esau's mother. He says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Now, before we go any further, I want to highlight a couple things from this text that would have already made this a bit of a weird story that deviates from what people in the ancient Near East would have expected. The way that the family unit was structured in ancient Near Eastern societies is that the family was run by a patriarch. That's the oldest male figure in the family. And this patriarch was responsible not only for his immediate family, but also for his extended family, for the families of his younger brothers and sisters. And so this position of being the patriarch, the position that the oldest son would eventually grow into, was a position of responsibility and privilege. But here in Genesis 25, God says that when it comes to Jacob and Esau, the older is going to serve the younger. And that is a completely countercultural, upside-down thing to do, because that's not the way it normally works. The younger son is supposed to submit to and serve the older one, not the other way around. And so when God says this in Genesis 25, he's hinting toward the reality that he's going to do something unique through Jacob and Esau, something that doesn't typically happen in most families. And this also isn't the only time that God does this in Genesis. This happened earlier in the previous generation with Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael. A couple weeks ago, we talked about how Abraham had a son named Ishmael with his wife's servant. And Ishmael was 14 years older than Isaac, but God's covenant and promise goes through Isaac, not Ishmael. And now here we're seeing that even though Esau is the older son of Isaac, the covenant is actually going through Jacob. And then if we look at the next generation and we look at Jacob's sons, we see that again, it's Jacob's son Joseph that goes on to lead the family. And he's one of the younger sons, not the older one like it's supposed to be. And I just want to highlight this now because this shows us that God's will, God's plan for our life is not necessarily dependent on the social norms around us. God doesn't fit inside of our little box of how we think he ought to work and operate. God's plan, God's agenda for our lives is much bigger and better than anything we can manufacture for ourselves. And if we try to fit God into our little box and put a limit on what God can do in our life, then we run the risk of losing out on a lot of what God has for us. Now, as we continue in Genesis 25, we see that the differences between Jacob and Esau only grow. Esau becomes a hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob is content to stay home among the tents. And we also see that there's some division that forms in their family, because Isaac, who has a taste for wild game, loves Esau, but Rebekah, their mother, loves Jacob. So there's also this reality of favoritism in their family as well, and that's actually going to be the foundation of a lot of the conflict that's to come. In Genesis 25, verses 29 to 34, it says, "Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, 'Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished.' And this is also why his name is called Edom, because Edom means red. Jacob replied, 'First sell me your birthright.' 'Look, I'm about to die,' Esau said. 'What good is my birthright to me?' But Jacob said, 'Swear to me first.' So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright." Now on the surface, this story might just seem kind of weird and inconsequential. Esau comes home really hungry, and Jacob demands that he sell his birthright in exchange for stew. But no money actually changes hands here. So what's going on here? What's the significance of this story? Well, in order to understand what's going on here, we have to go back to what was said earlier about the way that ancient Eastern families were structured, with the eldest son being the patriarch. Because the eldest son's position as patriarch, that was considered to be his birthright. And not only was it a place of privilege and status, but it also affected the inheritance that the older son would receive. When the father of the family, or the current patriarch, died, and he divided his wealth amongst his sons, the eldest son, who would become the next patriarch, always got a double share of the inheritance. And the reason why this was done is because in order to lead his family and care for his extended family members, the older son needed more than the rest of them. He needed a double share of the inheritance. So when Esau sells his birthright to his brother Jacob, this is what he's giving up. He's giving up his right to lead the family as the next patriarch. He's giving up a double share of the inheritance, and he's doing it for lentil stew, of all things. Now, from the text, it definitely sounds like Esau was pretty hungry and famished, but it's unlikely that he was actually in danger of dying if he didn't get this bowl of stew. And so when we look at the value of everything that Esau is giving up, it's far greater than what he gets in return. And while it's easy for us to point out the fault in Esau's actions, it also needs to be noted that many of us do the same today in regards to our internal inheritance that we receive from God because of the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross. Because Jesus died on the cross for our sins, we can have an eternal inheritance in heaven. One that starts today and that follows us into eternity. Yet often we forsake this inheritance for the momentary distractions and desires of this world that we choose to pursue instead of God. Often we try to put our own plans and our own agenda ahead of God's. And in so doing, we prioritize the things of this world instead of our relationship with God. We tell ourselves that as long as we do enough or achieve enough or buy enough, that is going to give us lasting satisfaction and fulfillment. But when we do that, then we lose sight of the fact that God's plan stands. We lose sight of the fact that God is sovereign and that we're not. And that at the end of the day, God's plan is bigger and better than anything we can manufacture for ourselves. And as we continue on in Genesis, we see that Esau is not the only one who struggles with this. In chapter 27, we see that Isaac, their father, decides to bless Esau instead of Jacob. Even though Isaac knows that before these two boys were born, God had told Rebekah that the older will serve the younger, Isaac says that he wants to go his own way, and he decides to bless Esau because he's his favorite. We see here that Isaac is making up his own plan about which son should carry the blessing and the covenant, and he's not actually trusting in God's plan. But as you might guess, this doesn't really work out very well. Isaac tells Esau to go into the open country and hunt some wild game and then bring it back for him so he can eat it and give Esau his blessing. But as he gives him these instructions, Rebekah overhears. And because she loves Jacob more, she wants him to carry the blessing. And so she goes to Jacob and tells him to deceive his father by pretending to be his brother so that he can steal Esau's blessing from him. And Jacob and Rebekah go to some pretty great lengths in order to make this deception work. They have a lamb slaughtered and prepared for Isaac to eat. And then Jacob puts on goat skin to make himself appear to be a hairier person like his brother. And this deception works because at the time Isaac is blind and can't actually see which son he's talking to. And so in Genesis 27 verse 29, Isaac gives Jacob this blessing. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. And then right after Isaac is done blessing Jacob, Esau comes back from his hunt and asks for Isaac's blessing. But we see that Isaac's blessing can't be reversed. In verses 39 to 40, he says this to Esau. Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck." Now, at first glance, this seems like a really unfair way to treat Esau. If Isaac had blessed Jacob, then why can't he also bless his brother? But the reality behind these blessings in Scripture is that these blessings are much more than just wishing someone well. There's actually a prophetic component to these blessings where they are words spoken over people's lives that foreshadow events in their life. And we see this is true of Jacob's descendants, who become the people of Israel that carried God's covenant or promise that God had originally made with Abraham. And we also see that what Isaac said to Esau also becomes true, because Esau's descendants become the nation of Edom, or the Edomites. And they live in the hill country of Seir, which is a very rocky, hilly terrain far from the richness of the earth where all the good farmland is. And they also become one of Israel's rivals. And there's almost constant tension throughout the Old Testament between the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau. But perhaps the most important thing for us to take note of in this passage is that just as God had said when Jacob and Esau were born, the younger son Jacob is the one who carries the blessing and the covenant, and the older son Esau serves the younger. This is important for us to take note of because at the end of the day, God's plan stands. Even though Isaac had wanted to go his own way and make his own plan about which son should carry the covenant, that didn't change God's will and intention. You see, we can choose to run away from God's plan for our life. We can tell ourselves that we know best and that we should just follow our heart. But at the end of the day, our hearts and feelings are deceptive above all else. And the best place to be is in the will of God. Because God's plan stands. God's plan for our life is bigger and better than anything we could manufacture for ourselves. Now, something else I should mention here is that this reality that God's plan stands doesn't excuse Jacob from deceiving his father and stealing his brother's blessing. Because we see here that Jacob really acts like a bit of a weasel. And instead of waiting for God to promote him in his own time, he takes matters into his own hands and causes a lot of division in his family because of it. It's actually a really interesting part of the narrative because in doing this, Jacob is really living up to his name because the name Jacob actually means deceiver. It's a terrible name to have, especially for a pastor, right? But don't let that influence your vote. Now, something else we see as we read through the rest of the book of Genesis is that this pattern of God's blessing going to the younger son and not the older son is a pattern that continues on into the next generation. When Jacob is old and about to die, he gives blessings to his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who are the sons of his son Joseph. There's a lot of sons in Genesis, it's hard to keep track of them all. But the blessing that Jacob gives to his grandsons is not what we might expect. In Genesis 48, verses 17 to 19, we read this. When Joseph saw his father place his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said, "No, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on him." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he and his descendants will become a group of nations." Here, Joseph expects that his eldest son Manasseh will receive the blessing, because that's how it's supposed to work. That's the cultural norm. But instead, Jacob blesses the younger son Ephraim. Jacob's learned from his own experience that God's plan stands, and that regardless of how we think things should work, God's really the one who calls the shots. He's the one who's sovereign. And if we're going to live by faith with complete trust and confidence in God, then we need to submit to his plan and purpose and not our own. And it seems like Joseph himself learns this by the end of his life, because Hebrews 11 verse 22 tells us that it was by faith that Joseph gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. We see this at the very end of Genesis, where it says this: "And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, 'God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place.'" Something that I find really interesting about Hebrews 11 is that the author of Hebrews has been showing us all of these stories about great heroes of the faith, people who lived lives marked by complete trust and confidence in God. But when he comes to the story of Joseph, the only thing that Hebrews mentions is how he wanted to be buried. And that's a very small part of Joseph's story. Joseph is the 11th born son of Jacob. And just like how Jacob and Esau's family was torn apart by favoritism and sibling rivalry, we see the same thing with Joseph. Joseph's brothers really resent that he is the favored son of their father Jacob. And so what they do is they sell him into slavery. And he winds up being a slave in Egypt. But through a series of miraculous events, Joseph rises to power in Egypt and becomes the right-hand man of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. It's really a miraculous story, but Hebrews doesn't talk about any of it. All Hebrews talks about is his desire to leave all of that behind and go back to the land of his fathers, back to the promised land of Canaan that God had originally promised to Joseph's great-grandfather Abraham. And this is a really interesting thing to think about, because Joseph was a guy that had everything we find valuable from a worldly point of view. He had fame, wealth, and power. But what he really wanted at the end of his life was to leave all of that behind and go back to the land that God had promised his ancestors. Back to the land God promised to Abraham. And the reason for this is because Joseph wasn't focused on his own plan and agenda for his life. He was focused on God's plan for his life and for the life of his ancestors and his descendants. He was focused on the promise and the covenant that God had made with Abraham. And so he was looking forward toward a future when that promise would be fulfilled and when his descendants would go back to the promised land of Canaan. Joseph was someone who lived with complete trust and confidence in God because he placed his faith in God's plan. He knew that God's plan stands. He knew that even though he had everything he could ask for in Egypt, God's plan for his life was bigger and better than anything he could manufacture for himself. So as we reflect today on the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we see that their faith had bumps and bruises along the way, but they're still considered to be people who lived by faith with complete trust and confidence in God because of their trust in God's plans and not their own. And as we reflect on that today, a question I want to ask is this: is God's plan and purpose something that we seek? Or do we just try to go our own way and make our own plans? Because something that Hebrews shows us is that if we're going to live by faith with complete trust and confidence in God, then we need to be seeking His plan and His will for our lives. When we run into a situation where we're not sure what to do, we need to make prayer our first response and not our last resort. Our default needs to be seeking God's will and God's plan for us in that situation. And can I just encourage you today that none of our problems are too big for God. God is a really big God, and He's been seeing and dealing with all kinds of different issues ever since the world began. He is a good and sovereign God, and His plan for our life is bigger and better than anything we can manufacture for ourselves. Amen?